When the sun slips behind the western hills, the palace of the pharaoh does not fall asleep. It exhales. The heat of the day loosens its grip, and with that release comes a different kind of tension, one that cannot survive daylight. Oil lamps are lit one by one, their flames small but deliberate, turning polished stone into a landscape of moving shadows. What looked grand and fixed under the sun now feels uncertain, almost fragile. The court after sunset is not a quieter version of the day. It is something else entirely. By daylight, power announces itself loudly. Titles are spoken, rituals are performed, and hierarchy is made visible through clothing, posture, and distance. At night, those signals fade. Authority withdraws into corners and listens. Long corridors that once echoed with ceremony narrow into tunnels of soft footsteps and controlled breath. Words become rare, and because they are rare, they become heavy. Every sound feels as though it might travel farther than intended. This is the hour when the court recalibrates. The pharaoh's palace becomes a living mechanism, adjusting its balance in silence. Servants move with practiced restraint, their eyes lowered not out of habit, but calculation. Guards shift their weight without speaking, aware that stillness can be as revealing as motion. Even doors seem to close more slowly, as if time itself has learned caution. Nothing is rushed, yet nothing is relaxed. History often presents ancient Egypt as a civilization of certainty, guided by gods, symbols, and unchanging order. But certainty struggles to survive the night. Darkness softens the edges of belief. It invites questions that daylight keeps at bay. In the absence of spectacle, people are left alone with intention. Who stands where they stand? Who remains awake when sleep would be safer? Who listens when silence would protect them? The court does not empty after sunset. It selects. Some figures drift away toward private chambers, dismissed without ceremony. Others remain, not because they were commanded to, but because they were permitted. That difference matters. Presence itself becomes a signal, though no one says so aloud. To be here, after the lamps are lit and the outer gates are sealed, is to exist inside a space where meaning is fluid and judgment is invisible. Night introduces a second layer of governance, one that leaves no inscriptions behind. Decisions are not announced. They are felt later, through changes that seem to arrive without cause. Favor shifts. Access narrows. A face once familiar becomes absent. The court learns to read these outcomes backward, tracing them to moments that occurred when no witnesses were meant to notice. What happens after dark does not compete with daylight authority. It shapes it quietly. There is a reason the palace feels different now. Fewer eyes does not mean less scrutiny. It means scrutiny has changed direction. In the dark, no one performs for crowds. They perform for survival. Every movement carries intention, whether conscious or not. Even the act of standing still can be a decision, one that will be remembered by someone watching from the edge of the light. Silence becomes a language. It stretches between people, asking questions that words would make dangerous. A pause before responding can be mistaken for hesitation. A glance held too long can become a message. The night does not forgive excess. It rewards those who understand how little is required to be noticed and how much can be lost by being seen too clearly. This is where the familiar image of the pharaoh's court begins to dissolve, not into chaos, but into something more precise and more unsettling. The order remains, yet it is no longer ceremonial. It is intimate. It operates through awareness rather than command. Those who sense this shift adjust instinctively. Those who do not rarely realize their mistake until much later. As the hours deepen, the palace settles into a rhythm that daylight never reveals. Lamps burn lower, shadows lengthen, conversations end before they begin. Somewhere within these walls, judgments are forming without sound. Tests are taking place without instructions, and while nothing appears to be happening, everything important already is. By the time the court finally grows still, the night has done its work. It has sorted, measured, and wade without leaving a mark. When morning returns, the palace will look unchanged, yet beneath that familiar surface, something has already moved, and only those who remained awake will know where to look next. The night does not announce its conclusions. It allows them to settle quietly into memory, where they will influence choices long after their origin is forgotten. Someone will be greeted differently at sunrise. Someone else will wait for a summons that never comes. No explanation will follow, because explanations weaken authority. What matters is that everyone senses the shift, even if no one can describe it. The palace teaches this lesson repeatedly. Understanding is optional. Awareness is not. As darkness holds the court a little longer, the remaining figures learn to read what cannot be spoken. They feel the boundaries of safety through intuition rather than rule. Each step, each pause, each breath becomes part of an unrecorded conversation. This is how power prefers to move when it wishes to remain unquestioned. By the time the first hint of dawn touches the horizon, the night has already chosen who belongs within the inner circle, and who will soon discover that the doors they once passed through now resist them. That question of belonging and exclusion lingers in the air as the next stage of the night quietly begins. It is this unseen selection that prepares the ground for everything that follows. The deeper the night goes, the fewer remain, and the more meaningful their presence becomes. What appears calm is already tense with implication, drawing the listener forward toward the hidden rules that decide who is permitted to stay awake. Those questions will soon demand answers, spoken softly, in places where daylight never listens or remembers afterward. When the final rites of the evening faded and the palace settled into its darker rhythm, dismissal arrived without announcement. It was not spoken, written, or enforced by guards. It was understood. Courtiers who had spent the day orbiting power began to drift away, their departure guided by habit rather than command. They did not ask permission to leave, and no one thanked them for staying. The absence of instruction was itself the signal. Night did not welcome everyone. It selected. Those who remained inside the palace walls after this quiet thinning felt the shift immediately. The air seemed heavier, as if sound itself had learned restraint. Lamps were fewer now, placed not for beauty but for necessity. Every remaining figure was visible, even in shadow, because presence had become rare. Staying awake was never described as an honor, yet everyone knew it was noticed. To remain was to step closer to something undefined, where attention replaced protection. The Pharaoh did not announce who was allowed to stay. That knowledge circulated silently, passed through subtle cues and long familiarity. Certain guards remained at their posts, chosen not for strength but for discretion. Specific priests lingered near inner chambers, their duties extending beyond ritual into watchfulness. Favored servants continued their routes, careful not to appear curious. A small number of courtiers, never the same each night, found themselves still inside when the gates closed, unsure whether their presence signaled trust or suspicion. What made the night unsettling was that no one explained its rules. Endurance replaced instruction. Those who stayed were not tested through tasks or questions, but through restraint. The court watched how they occupied time. Did they speak when nothing required speech? Did they move as though they needed to be seen? Or did they understand that stillness could be safer than action? In the darkness, effort was suspicious. Silence, when chosen correctly, became a form of wisdom. Observation during these hours was constant yet invisible. No one stood openly judging. Instead, attention flowed through the palace like a current, touching everyone without revealing its source. A servant pausing too long outside a chamber, a courtier adjusting position unnecessarily, a guard shifting weight at the wrong moment. Each small choice accumulated meaning. None of it was recorded. None of it was discussed. Yet outcomes followed with unsettling consistency. Those who misunderstood the nature of this attention often believed they were being evaluated for ambition or usefulness. They tried to demonstrate value, offering whispered insights or small acts of initiative. This was almost always a mistake. Nighttime loyalty was not about contribution. It was about alignment. The court wanted to know who could exist near power without reaching for it, who could witness without inserting themselves, who understood that survival sometimes depended on doing nothing at all. Over time, experienced courtiers learned to fear nighttime access as much as they desired it. To be dismissed early was not always an insult. To remain was not always a reward. Presence carried risk because it invited interpretation. Every night offered a fresh opportunity to fail without ever knowing why. The palace did not correct behavior. It responded to it quietly, later, in ways that could not be traced back to a single moment. This uncertainty was deliberate. By refusing to define the rules, the pharaoh allowed the night to function as a filter. Those who needed clarity exposed themselves through questions. Those who trusted routine exposed themselves through complacency. Only a few learned to read the subtle language of darkness, where meaning lived in pauses and boundaries rather than commands. These individuals did not stand out. That was the point. Staying awake also meant accepting proximity to judgment without access to explanation. If favor shifted, it did so silently. Invitations changed. Routes were altered. Faces that once returned, a glance now looked past. The court understood these signs instinctively, even if no one acknowledged them aloud. The night left impressions rather than evidence. It shaped behavior without ever justifying itself. The most unsettling truth was that many never realized they were being tested at all. They believed the night was simply quieter, less demanding, a space between days. By the time they noticed something had changed, the origin was already unreachable. The test had passed without notice, and its outcome was irreversible. In this way, the night protected the pharaoh from confrontation. Loyalty revealed itself naturally, without interrogation. As hours deepened and fewer figures remained, the meaning of presence intensified. Each person still awake became more visible, not because they were illuminated, but because absence had surrounded them. The palace felt smaller, tighter, as if walls themselves were listening. Those who understood this did not relax as the night progressed. They became more careful, more contained, aware that the quiet was not empty. It was attentive. By the time the deepest hours arrived, the night had already sorted those within its reach. Some would return the next evening without realizing why. Others would find themselves gently excluded, their absence explained by routine rather than decision. No announcement would mark the change. The palace would simply remember differently. This silent sorting prepared the ground for what followed. Presence had proven itself meaningful. Absence had proven itself intentional. And now, with the court reduced to its most carefully observed figures, the task of watching could begin in earnest. Those assigned to observe did not need to be told. They had already been staying awake. When darkness settles fully over the palace, the guards do not relax their posture. They change it. By day, their presence is defined by visibility. Armor catches the light, weapons signal readiness, and their task is obvious: stand, watch, deter. At night, those signals lose importance. What matters now cannot be seen so easily. The guards remain, but their attention turns inward, toward the subtle movements of people rather than the obvious threat of force. In these hours, a guard's value is measured not by strength, but by perception. They are trained, over years, to notice what others overlook. A hesitation before answering a simple question, a servant who changes direction for no clear reason, a courtier whose voice lowers too quickly when approaching a familiar face. None of these moments prove anything on their own. Together, they form patterns. The guards learn to collect these patterns quietly, storing impressions instead of facts. At night, listening becomes more important than watching. Words spoken softly often carry more weight than actions performed loudly. A pause can suggest uncertainty. A rushed explanation can signal fear. Even silence, when it appears where speech is expected, becomes meaningful. The guards are not instructed to interpret these signs openly. They are encouraged to notice them, to feel when something does not align, and to remember that feeling. Certainty is discouraged. Ambiguity is the point. This approach creates a different kind of vigilance. The guards are not searching for criminals, they are sensing imbalance. They pay attention to rhythm, to how people move through space, to whether their presence feels settled or strained. Over time, this sensitivity becomes instinctive. A guard may not be able to explain why someone draws attention, only that they do. That impression, vague as it is, can still travel upward through the palace. Importantly, the guards are never told exactly what to report. No list exists, no standard defines suspicion. This lack of clarity is intentional. It forces the guards to rely on judgment rather than instruction, and judgment reveals character. What a guard chooses to mention and what they choose to ignore becomes a reflection of their own alignment. In this way, observation flows in both directions. The watchers are also being watched. A guard who reports too much risks, appearing anxious or manipulative. One who reports nothing risks appearing careless or disloyal. The balance is delicate. Many learn that restraint is safer than enthusiasm. Others never adjust, believing that visibility equals value. Those guards often disappear quietly, reassigned or dismissed without explanation. No one announces why. The remaining guards understand without asking. The palace, at night, functions like a closed circuit. Information moves slowly, rarely spoken directly, shaped by interpretation at every stage. A guard may share an impression with a superior, who then shares only part of it with someone higher still. By the time it reaches its destination, it has become something abstract, stripped of detail but heavy with implication. This is enough. Precision is not required. Suggestion is more useful. The effect of this system spreads beyond the guards themselves. Courtiers sense it. Servants feel it. Even those who never speak to a guard directly adjust their behavior, aware that attention does not require interaction. The possibility of being noticed changes how people breathe, how they stand, how long they linger. The night teaches everyone to self-regulate. Fear does not arrive as panic, it arrives as caution. Guards learn quickly that their greatest asset is patience. Intervening too soon disrupts the flow of information. Speaking too loudly breaks the atmosphere of restraint. At night, the ideal guard almost disappears. He stands where he is meant to stand and absorbs what passes near him. He does not react. Reaction reveals intention, and intention can be read. Neutrality, even if imperfect, offers protection. Yet neutrality is never complete. Every guard carries assumptions, instincts shaped by past nights and quiet outcomes. Over time, these instincts harden into something like belief. Certain behaviors feel dangerous, even if they are harmless. Certain silences feel safe, even if they are not. The system does not correct these biases. It absorbs them. This is how ambiguity becomes policy without ever being declared. The guards understand that what they notice tonight may matter weeks later, or not at all. There is no immediate feedback, no confirmation. This lack of resolution keeps them alert. Each night feels unfinished, as if something important almost happened but did not. The tension never fully releases. It accumulates slowly, shaping the court's mood in ways no single decision could. In this environment, truth becomes less important than coherence. The palace does not seek accuracy, it seeks consistency. Guards are valued for sensing when someone does not fit, not for proving why. Proof invites challenge. Impressions slide through unseen. This is how the court protects itself from confrontation. Nothing concrete can be argued against. As the night deepens, the guards remain in place, listening to what is said and what is avoided. They become familiar with the sound of whispered names, with the weight of pauses, with the meaning of footsteps that stop just short of a doorway. Over time, they recognize that the most important signals are not dramatic. They are quiet, almost boring, easy to miss unless one is trained to wait. This waiting defines the guard's true role. He is not there to stop what happens. He is there to notice it without interrupting. The palace depends on this restraint. Without it, the night would lose its power to reveal. The guards, standing in shadow, ensure that nothing needs to be forced into the open. Everything important will surface on its own, given enough silence, and silence, once established, begins to speak. It carries whispers, fragments of intent, pieces of fear. The guards hear these things long before anyone else does. They do not chase them. They let them pass, knowing that what is said quietly often travels farther than what is shouted. In the darkness, doubt does not announce itself. It murmurs. After the palace settles into its deepest quiet, sound does not disappear. It changes form. Voices lower not because silence is required, but because volume invites certainty, and certainty invites danger. Whispers take its place. They slip between columns, linger near doorways, and vanish before they can be claimed. In the Pharaoh's court, whispered words often carried more weight than proclamations spoken aloud beneath the sun. These conversations were never casual. A whisper was shaped carefully before it left the mouth. It needed to be vague enough to deny if repeated, yet sharp enough to leave an impression. Nothing was stated directly. Names were implied, intentions suggested. A single phrase, spoken softly at the right moment, could alter how someone was seen for weeks afterward. The speaker rarely witnessed the outcome. That was part of the power. Whispers traveled through the palace like slow-moving currents. Servants carried them unknowingly while delivering food or messages. Guards absorbed fragments as they stood in shadow. Priests encountered them near sacred spaces where silence already held authority. No single person controlled their direction. Each listener reshaped what they heard, adjusting tone or emphasis, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. By the time a whisper reached its destination, it often no longer resembled its origin. This uncertainty made whispered speech uniquely dangerous. No one could predict which words would be repeated accurately, which would be distorted, and which would be deliberately altered. Once released, a whisper belonged to the palace, not the speaker. Some whispers acted as shields, redirecting attention away from those who sensed danger approaching. Others functioned like slow poison, weakening trust without ever causing visible harm. The court rarely confronted these effects openly. Doing so would require acknowledging the mechanism itself. Silence often followed a whisper, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was an evaluative one. A name mentioned too frequently began to feel heavier. A behavior once overlooked now appeared suspicious. Privileges changed without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving. Access narrowed. No accusation was spoken aloud, because accusations invite defense. The palace preferred outcomes without argument. Those on the receiving end often sensed something had shifted, though they could not identify when or why. The absence of clarity was deliberate. Without a clear charge, there was nothing to contest. The whisper had already done its work. The individual adjusted behavior instinctively, becoming quieter, more careful, sometimes too careful. That, too, was noticed. The palace read reactions as carefully as it read initial behavior. Whispered language thrived because it left no record. Scribes did not write it. Officials did not acknowledge it. Even memory treated it gently, blurring edges over time. This lack of permanence made whispers powerful. They could not be disproven because they were never formally stated. They could not be defended against because they never appeared in full. The most dangerous words in the palace were those no one could quote. Some whispers were never meant to travel far. They were spoken only to test trust, to see how quickly a listener repeated them, or how subtly they reshaped them. In this way, whispers became tools for measuring loyalty. A person who carried a whisper forward too eagerly revealed impatience. One who refused to carry it at all revealed fear. Only a few learned to let whispers pass through them without leaving a trace. Yet even restraint carried risk. Silence could be interpreted as concealment. The palace valued balance, not purity. A whisper left untouched might return later, reshaped by someone else, carrying suspicion toward the one who heard it first. In this environment, there was no perfectly safe response. Every choice created potential meaning. Survival depended on sensing which risks were smaller in a given moment. Over time, the court developed an instinctive awareness of whispered currents. People learned when to lean closer and when to withdraw. They learned which spaces invited quiet speech and which punished it. Certain corridors, certain corners, certain moments after rituals ended became known for soft voices. These patterns were never discussed. They emerged naturally, guided by outcomes rather than instruction. The most unsettling aspect of whispered power was how easily it erased responsibility. Careers collapsed without anyone admitting involvement. Reputations dissolved without confrontation. Those harmed by whispers often suspected who had spoken, but suspicion without proof offered no protection. Speaking in defense only invited further interpretation. The safest response was often acceptance, a quiet retreat that confirmed nothing and challenged no one. This system allowed the court to regulate itself without force. Conflict rarely escalated into open hostility because it rarely needed to. Whispers adjusted behavior long before tension reached the surface. They softened resistance, redirected ambition, and reminded everyone that visibility carried cost. The palace did not need to silence voices aggressively. It allowed them to silence each other. As the night continued, whispers accumulated, overlapping and dissolving, leaving behind an atmosphere rather than a record. By morning, no one could point to a single conversation that caused change. Yet change was everywhere. The court felt different, as if something had shifted slightly out of alignment. That feeling lingered, influencing choices long after the words themselves were forgotten. This is why whispered speech remained the palace's most effective language. It required no authority, no command, no proof. It relied on human instinct, curiosity, fear, and the need to belong. Those instincts did the rest. The court understood this deeply, even if it never spoke the understanding aloud. And whispers never moved on their own. They required carriers, people whose presence seemed insignificant enough to pass unnoticed. The palace depended on these quiet messengers, not because they were powerful, but because they were everywhere. To understand how whispers truly shaped fate, one had to look away from those who spoke them, and toward those who carried them forward without ever realizing the weight they bore. By daylight, the servants of the palace fade into the background like part of the architecture. They pour wine, sweep stone floors, carry linens, and stand just far enough away to avoid notice. Their names are rarely spoken, their faces rarely remembered. In the official story of the court, they barely exist at all. Yet when night arrives, the balance quietly shifts. As the palace empties and the circle tightens, servants do not leave. They move deeper inside. At night, the servants become the palace's circulatory system. They pass through corridors others are not permitted to enter. They cross thresholds without challenge, carrying trays, lamps, scrolls, and sealed objects whose contents are not meant for them to know. Doors open for them without question. Voices lower when they pass, not out of respect, but habit. Over time, this access becomes invisible, even to those who depend on it. That invisibility is not natural. It is learned. From their first days, servants are trained not just in labor, but in erasure. They learn how to walk without sound, how to breathe shallowly when close to others, how to keep their eyes lowered without appearing fearful. They are taught where to pause and where not to linger, when to enter and when to vanish. The goal is simple: to be present without being acknowledged. Those who fail at this are noticed. Those who succeed disappear. This disappearance grants them a peculiar kind of freedom. While courtiers measure every word and guards weigh every movement, servants move through the palace as if untethered by consequence. They hear fragments of conversation never meant for them. They witness expressions that vanish the moment someone realizes they are not alone. They see which doors open late at night and which remain sealed. They notice patterns not because they seek them, but because they are everywhere. The court depends on this silence. Servants are expected to forget what they hear, to misplace what they see, to carry knowledge without holding it. At the same time, the court never fully trusts them. This contradiction sits at the heart of palace life. Servants are relied upon precisely because they are ignored, and feared precisely because they are so close. Their presence is tolerated, but their awareness is unsettling. Some servants learn to survive by becoming almost mechanical. They deliver, withdraw, repeat. They flatten their expression until nothing remains to be read. These servants last the longest, but they remain powerless, forever caught between visibility and erasure. Others, rarer and more dangerous, learn to understand the value of what they witness. They do not speak, they do not warn, they do not intervene. They simply remember when remembering is useful and forget when forgetting is safer. This quiet awareness allows certain servants to shape outcomes without ever appearing involved. A tray delivered slightly later than expected. A lamp placed closer to one doorway than another. A message carried along a longer route. None of these actions can be proven intentional. Each is small enough to dismiss, yet together they can alter the timing of a meeting, the mood of a room, the sequence of events. The palace notices results, not causes. Other servants are not so fortunate. Some are punished not for action, but for proximity. Being present when something sensitive occurs can be enough. Knowledge itself is treated as contamination. A servant who happens to witness an argument or overhear a whispered name may be reassigned, removed, or dismissed without explanation. The court does not accuse them of anything. It simply ensures they are no longer nearby. This creates a culture of careful absence. Servants learn to sense when they should not see, when they should turn away before being told. They develop an instinct for danger that has nothing to do with threat and everything to do with awareness. Over time, this instinct becomes more reliable than instruction. The palace rarely needs to discipline servants directly. They discipline themselves through anticipation. What makes this system effective is that it leaves no trace. No order is written. No punishment is declared. A servant simply stops appearing. Another quietly takes their place. The court continues without disruption. Those above rarely reflect on these changes. Those below understand them perfectly. The audience begins to see that rank alone does not define power. Access does. Servants, though low in status, possess unparalleled access to space, time, and movement. They are present at moments when decisions form but are not yet spoken. They move between factions without belonging to any. This makes them both insignificant and indispensable. Yet the cost of this position is constant tension. A servant must remain invisible while being everywhere. They must hear without listening, see without noticing, remember without recalling. Any failure to maintain this balance can be fatal to their position, if not their life. The palace offers no protection for those who know too much. As night deepens, servants continue their routes, quieter now, fewer in number. Their footsteps echo faintly, then vanish. Somewhere behind them, a decision settles into place. Somewhere ahead, a whisper waits to be carried. The servants will move between these moments, connecting them without ever being named. This is how the palace truly functions after dark. Not through declarations or commands, but through those who pass unnoticed between rooms. To understand what happens next, one must look even closer, beyond movement and access, to the unspoken trials that decide which servants remain trusted and which are quietly erased. No command was ever spoken to begin these trials. That was the first lesson. In the Pharaoh's court, the most important tests were never announced, because announcement invited preparation. Servants were not summoned, questioned, or warned. Instead, the palace adjusted itself slightly, almost imperceptibly, and waited to see who noticed, and how they responded. An object might be left unattended in a corridor where it did not belong. A lamp might burn longer than expected outside a sealed chamber. Instructions that normally arrived at a precise hour might come late or not at all. A familiar route could be blocked without explanation, forcing a servant to choose between waiting, rerouting, or asking. Each of these moments appeared trivial. None carried visible consequence, yet each was deliberate. The servant was never told they were being observed. That uncertainty was essential. The court was not interested in rehearsed loyalty or performative obedience. It wanted instinct. Did the servant hesitate before touching what was not theirs? Did they wait rather than question delay? Did they accept inconvenience without frustration? Or did emotion rise too quickly, revealing a need for certainty where uncertainty was required? No response was corrected in the moment. There was no feedback, no sign that a choice had been noted. The servant continued their duties as usual, unaware that a decision had already been weighed. Days might pass, weeks, sometimes longer. Then, without explanation, something changed. A route was reassigned, a duty removed. A familiar face stopped appearing beside them in the early hours. The outcome arrived quietly, disconnected from its cause. Many servants never realized they had been tested at all. They believed the palace was simply unpredictable, that changes were random or inevitable. This belief protected the system. If trials were visible, they could be discussed. If they were discussed, they could be challenged. Silence prevented both. Judgment without explanation left no place for appeal. Those who failed rarely understood why. They replayed recent days in their minds, searching for mistakes, but found nothing concrete. There was no single moment to point to, no action clearly wrong. That uncertainty often lingered long after their removal, a lesson absorbed by those who remained. The palace did not need to threaten. The absence of clarity was enough. What the court measured was not competence, but restraint. A servant who reacted emotionally, even briefly, revealed something dangerous. Emotion suggested expectation. Expectation suggested entitlement. Entitlement had no place near absolute power. The ideal servant accepted disruption without response, delay without irritation, confusion without protest. Silence became the clearest signal of alignment. This system replaced instruction with atmosphere. Servants learned not from rules, but from watching others disappear. They learned which behaviors coincided with absence, which with quiet survival. Over time, this awareness shaped them more effectively than any training. They did not need to be told what loyalty looked like. They felt it in their bodies, as tension held just beneath the surface. The cruelty of this method lay in its impersonality. The court did not appear cruel, because it never acknowledged punishment. It simply adjusted access. Those removed were not accused. They were forgotten. That forgetting was complete. No mention, no explanation, no record. It was as if the servant had never existed within the palace at all. For those who remained, this created a careful distance from certainty. They avoided strong reactions, strong opinions, strong attachments. Even kindness became measured. Too much concern for others could be interpreted as alliance. Too little could be read as indifference. Balance was everything, yet balance was never defined. Each servant learned it alone, through quiet observation and fear of error. The emotional weight of this uncertainty was constant. Servants lived with the knowledge that any moment, no matter how small, might already have been evaluated. This did not produce panic. Panic was visible, and visibility was dangerous. Instead, it produced stillness. Movements became economical. Expression softened, breathing slowed. The body learned obedience before the mind understood it. In this way, loyalty became something passive rather than active. It was not proven by action, but by absence of reaction. The court trusted those who did not assert themselves, who did not need explanation, who did not seek reassurance. Silence was not emptiness. It was evidence. The audience begins to feel the discomfort of this system because it removes the comfort of fairness. There is no clear standard, no path to safety that can be followed deliberately. Survival depends on sensing what is not said, on responding correctly to conditions that shift without warning. This mirrors a deeper truth about power. It prefers instinctive compliance to conscious agreement. These silent trials did not end when a servant passed them once. They repeated, subtly, endlessly. Loyalty was not confirmed permanently. It was reassessed continuously, night after night, through small moments that left no trace. A servant could survive for years and still be removed after a single misread situation. The palace did not need to watch constantly. It created conditions that encouraged self-surveillance. Servants monitored themselves, adjusting behavior before correction was required. This made control efficient and nearly invisible. The court did not chase loyalty. It allowed loyalty to reveal itself. As the night progressed and servants continued their quiet movement, each one carried this awareness with them. Every step, every pause, every decision unfolded beneath unseen judgment. No command guided them, no voice corrected them, yet judgment was already moving, already forming, already final. And above this silent obedience, beyond the reach of servants and guards alike, were figures who interpreted silence itself as language. The next layer of the palace listened not to behavior, but to what it suggested about forces beyond human intention. From here, the story ascends, toward those who believed the night spoke not only of loyalty, but of the gods. When the palace slipped fully into darkness, the priests did not withdraw. They emerged. While others learned to fear the night for its uncertainty, the priesthood had long treated it as sacred territory. Darkness was not the absence of order to them. It was the condition required for a deeper one to appear. The hours after sunset were believed to belong less to humans and more to forces that daylight kept at bay. Certain rituals were never performed beneath the sun. Light was thought to dilute their meaning, to scatter what needed to remain concentrated. Midnight, in particular, was treated as a threshold rather than a time. It marked a fragile pause, a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. The boundary between the mortal and the unseen was believed to thin, not dramatically, but subtly, like a veil drawn just far enough aside to glimpse movement beyond it. Priests moved through the palace during these hours with a different authority than guards or officials. They carried no weapons and issued no commands. Instead, they carried incense, sealed texts, and objects whose purpose was never explained aloud. Their voices were low, not out of secrecy, but reverence. Words spoken too loudly were thought to lose their shape before reaching the gods. Silence was not emptiness here, it was preparation. The rituals themselves were never meant to be witnessed. They took place in chambers lit by a single flame, or in corridors where shadows gathered thickly along the walls. The narration of these moments does not dwell on technique or doctrine, because the power of the rituals did not lie in instruction. It lay in atmosphere. Slow movements, repeated gestures, the steady rhythm of breath and murmur. The audience is invited not to understand, but to feel the weight of intention pressing into the dark. During these sacred hours, priests became interpreters rather than leaders. Their role was not to speak for the gods, but to listen for signs others could not perceive. A flicker in a flame that bent the wrong way. A sudden chill where warmth should have remained. A sound that echoed too long after footsteps ended. These disturbances were not proof of anything on their own. Meaning emerged only through careful interpretation. This interpretive authority made the priests indispensable at night. Pharaohs and courtiers alike depended on them to translate what could not be confronted directly. The gods did not issue clear instructions. They hinted, warned, obscured. The priest's task was to shape these fragments into something usable without claiming certainty. Too much confidence invited punishment from both divine and human powers. Too little made the priest irrelevant. Yet this position was more dangerous than it appeared. Unlike servants, priests were visible. Unlike guards, they were expected to explain what they sensed. A misread omen could not be undone. If a sign was interpreted incorrectly, the consequences might not be immediate, but they were inevitable. Crops failed, illness spread, political decisions soured. Somewhere along that chain, blame would circle back to the one who spoke first. The court never accused a priest openly of misreading the divine. That would imply that the gods could be questioned. Instead, priests who lost favor simply stopped being summoned. Their chambers went dark. Their voices were no longer requested in the night. Others stepped into their place without comment. The palace treated this as correction rather than punishment. The gods, it was assumed, had already judged. This fragility shaped how priests behaved after sunset. They spoke carefully, choosing language that allowed for reinterpretation later. They emphasized possibilities rather than conclusions. They learned to listen longer than they spoke, to wait for patterns rather than seize on signs. Their authority depended not on certainty, but on restraint. A priest who rushed to meaning revealed impatience, and impatience was a human flaw the gods were believed to exploit. The night magnified this tension. Each ritual carried the possibility of insight and error in equal measure. Each interpretation could elevate a priest's standing or quietly end it. This kept the priesthood disciplined in a way no decree could. Fear and reverence blended until they were indistinguishable. Serving the gods and surviving the court became the same task. For the audience, this reframed spiritual power as something unstable rather than absolute. The priests were not mystical figures standing above politics. They were embedded within it, navigating risk through symbolism and silence. Their influence came not from command, but from proximity to uncertainty. They stood closest to questions no one else could ask openly. As the sacred hours progressed, the palace seemed to lean inward. Lamps burned lower, movement slowed. Even the guards appeared less rigid near ritual spaces, as if aware that force had no place there. The priests continued their work quietly, knowing that what they failed to notice might matter more than what they named. And beneath all of this, ritual attention lay an even more intimate channel of meaning. The gods did not always speak through signs or ceremonies. Sometimes their messages arrived without witnesses, without incense, without preparation. They came in the most vulnerable state of all, when authority slept and the mind wandered unguarded. If the night was sacred, then dreams were its most personal language, waiting just beyond the edge of consciousness. Dreams entered the palace without warning and without permission. They did not follow protocol, did not respect rank, and did not wait to be summoned. They arrived in the most defenseless hours of the night, when even the Pharaoh laid aside ceremony and closed his eyes. In the court of ancient Egypt, dreams were never dismissed as imagination. They were believed to be messages delivered directly to the soul, bypassing reason and authority alike. No dream was considered private. To dream was to receive something, and receiving demanded response. Pharaohs, nobles, and courtiers often woke with a sense of dread rather than curiosity, replaying images they did not understand but could not ignore. A river flowing backward, a falcon with broken wings, a throne standing empty beneath a blackened sun. These visions did not explain themselves, and that uncertainty was their power. Dreams were reported quietly, almost reluctantly. To speak of one was to invite interpretation, and interpretation carried risk. Priests were summoned in secrecy, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in chambers where only a single lamp burned. They listened carefully, not just to the dream itself, but to how it was told. Tone mattered. Hesitation mattered. What the dreamer emphasized often mattered more than what they described. There was no fixed language for dreams. Symbols shifted meaning depending on context, timing, and the dreamer's position. A snake could represent protection one night and betrayal the next. Water could promise renewal or warn of loss. This fluidity made interpretation dangerous. A single phrase, spoken with too much certainty or too little care, could ripple outward through the court. Alignments shifted. Suspicions formed. decisions were made before the sun rose. The danger did not always lie in the dream's content. It lay in how others responded to it. Once spoken, a dream could not be taken back. Even if dismissed publicly, it lingered privately. No decree could erase a bad omen once it entered the shared awareness of the court. The pharaoh might rule by divine authority, but even he could not command the meaning of a vision that unsettled those around him. This made dreams uniquely destabilizing. They introduced uncertainty that no ritual could fully contain. A pharaoh might appear unshaken by a troubling dream, but those listening would watch more closely in the days that followed. Was a delay intentional, or was it fear? Was a sudden favor a reward, or an attempt to protect against something unseen? The dream reshaped perception, whether acknowledged or not. Some rulers tried to control the influence of dreams by limiting who could hear them. Others attempted the opposite, sharing them widely to diffuse their impact. Neither approach offered safety. A dream heard by few could be magnified through whispers. One heard by many could fracture into competing interpretations. The palace learned that dreams could not be managed, only endured. Courtiers, too, feared their own visions. A dream might reveal ambition they had never spoken aloud, or danger they were not prepared to face. Reporting it risked exposure. Concealing it risked accusation if it surfaced later through other means. Many chose silence, carrying their fear alone, adjusting behavior subtly in hopes of avoiding what they could not name. This, too, was noticed. Priests approached dreams with caution shaped by experience. They knew that certainty was rarely rewarded. Instead, they spoke in layers, offering possibilities rather than conclusions. This protected them, but it did not eliminate risk. If events later aligned with a dream's darker interpretation, the priest who failed to emphasize it might be blamed. If nothing happened, the priest who warned too strongly might be accused of fear-mongering. Balance was everything, and balance was fragile. The pharaoh's vulnerability was most visible here. In dreams, divine kingship offered no shield. Sleep reduced all humans to the same state, open to images they did not choose. A pharaoh could command armies, but he could not command his own subconscious. This truth unsettled the court more than any external threat. If the gods could reach the ruler directly, without ceremony, then power was never fully secure. Morning councils were often shaped by visions no one else could see. A decision delayed, a journey postponed, a person kept close or pushed away. These choices were rarely explained. Explanation weakened authority. The court learned to read between actions, sensing when a dream had cast its shadow. Even those who doubted divine messages adjusted their behavior because doubt offered no protection against consequence. Over time, the palace developed a quiet fear of dreams, not because they were supernatural, but because they disrupted certainty. They arrived uninvited. They resisted control. They demanded interpretation without offering clarity. In a system built on silence and suggestion, dreams were the purest expression of both. As night gave way to dawn, the images of sleep did not fade. They followed the dreamer into waking hours, shaping tone, posture, and trust. The palace resumed its routines, but something invisible had already shifted. Somewhere behind a steady gaze or a measured command, a vision lingered, unresolved. This was the deeper danger of dreams. They did not announce outcomes. They unsettled foundations. They reminded the court that even the highest authority rested on fragile ground, vulnerable to forces that could not be interrogated or dismissed. The gods, if they spoke, did so without concern for stability. And when the palace lights dimmed again the following night, those who had dreamed lay awake longer than usual. Sleep was no longer rest. It was exposure. In the darkness, the pharaoh himself listened not for footsteps or whispers, but for the echo of images that might return unbidden. From that vigilance, from that doubt, grew questions not even a king could ask aloud, about loyalty, trust, and who truly watched while he slept. By day, the pharaoh stood at the center of a carefully constructed world. Gold caught the sun, rituals unfolded with perfect rhythm. Every movement, every word, reinforced the idea that power flowed outward from him, complete and unquestioned. The court saw a living God, distant and immutable, sustained by symbols that left no room for doubt. Yet when night arrived, that image began to loosen, not publicly, but privately, where no witnesses were meant to linger. After sunset, the Pharaoh withdrew from spectacle into guarded stillness. His chambers were not places of rest so much as containment. Doors were sealed one by one, not only to keep danger out, but to hold certainty in. Guards rotated with silent precision, their presence reassuring yet never sufficient. Each shift reminded the Pharaoh that protection required constant renewal. Nothing was assumed to last through the night without effort. Inside these private spaces, rituals lost their public meaning. They were no longer performed to affirm divine order, but to soothe unease. Familiar words were repeated, gestures retraced, symbols arranged and rearranged. The repetition was not habit, it was reassurance. Each act whispered the same promise, that order still held, that nothing had slipped beyond control. Yet the very need to repeat these rituals revealed their fragility. The Pharaoh spoke less at night. Words carried risk in darkness. Instead, he listened. He listened to footsteps outside his chambers, to the cadence of guards changing posts, to the distant sounds of a palace that never truly slept. Every sound became a question. Was it routine or deviation? Was it coincidence or intention? Silence, too, demanded interpretation. An expected noise that failed to arrive could be more unsettling than one that did. This was the paradox of absolute power. The higher authority rose, the fewer people could be trusted fully. Loyalty was never static. It shifted with ambition, fear, and time. The Pharaoh understood this better than anyone. His survival depended not on belief in his divinity, but on continuous assessment. Trust could not be granted permanently. It had to be monitored, tested, renewed. At night, without ceremony to reinforce hierarchy, power felt exposed. There were no crowds to affirm obedience, no rituals to project certainty outward. The Pharaoh faced the quiet truth that authority required constant attention to remain intact. A single misjudgment, a single overlooked shift in loyalty, could begin a chain reaction impossible to stop once daylight returned. This awareness shaped how the Pharaoh moved through the night. He did not pace restlessly or show outward anxiety. Such behavior would betray weakness. Instead, he practiced vigilance disguised as calm. His stillness was deliberate, his pauses measured. Even alone, he maintained discipline, knowing that discipline itself was a form of defense. The illusion of omnipotence required careful maintenance precisely because it was convincing. Those who believed in it behaved differently, more predictably. Fear and reverence produced order. Doubt introduced chaos. The Pharaoh could not allow doubt to surface, not even within himself. And yet, night had a way of inviting it. Darkness removed distractions. It stripped power down to awareness and responsibility. Guards were instructed to rotate frequently during these hours, not because danger increased, but because stagnation bred complacency. Fresh eyes mattered. Familiarity dulled perception. The Pharaoh trusted process more than individuals. Systems, unlike people, did not dream or hesitate, but systems were built and maintained by people, and that truth could not be ignored for long. Within the sealed chambers, the Pharaoh confronted the limits of his reach. He could command armies, rewrite laws, reshape cities. He could not see every corner of his own palace. He could not hear every whisper, interpret every silence. This gap between authority and knowledge was small, but it was enough to cause unease. Power was strongest when it appeared complete, weakest when it revealed its edges. The court outside sensed this tension, though it was never spoken. The Pharaoh's silence at night carried weight. Those summoned during these hours entered cautiously, aware that every interaction mattered more than it did by day. A word misplaced could echo longer in darkness. A gesture misread could linger in memory. The absence of witnesses made each exchange feel heavier, more personal. Absolute power, the audience begins to realize, was never absolute in practice. It was negotiated constantly through observation and restraint. The pharaoh did not rule by confidence alone. He ruled by vigilance, by anticipating shifts before they became visible. This vigilance demanded energy, attention, and an acceptance that certainty was an illusion requiring daily reinforcement. The night magnified this truth. Without the sun to sanctify signals of dominance, authority depended on quiet systems working without failure, guards listening rather than watching, servants moving without being seen, priests interpreting signs without overreaching. All of it converged around a single figure who carried the weight of maintaining balance. The pharaoh never slept easily, not because of fear of assassination, but because of awareness. Sleep meant surrendering control, even briefly. It meant trusting that the systems he had built would function without his supervision. This trust was necessary, but it was never comfortable. He rested, knowing that his power endured only as long as nothing unexpected emerged while he was unaware. This is where the image of the untouchable God-King fractures. Beneath the golden ceremony was a human consciousness calculating risk in the dark. The illusion of certainty required effort precisely because it was so effective. Those who benefited from it did not need to understand its maintenance. The pharaoh did. As the night deepened, vigilance replaced rest. Thoughts turned inward, measuring loyalty without revealing doubt. The pharaoh understood that asking direct questions invited answers he could not control. Better to let behavior reveal itself naturally, without prompting. Better to create conditions where loyalty emerged unforced. From this need grew a different approach to power, one that avoided confrontation and thrived on subtle testing. If authority could not be confirmed openly, it could be measured indirectly. And so, in the quiet hours when even God seemed vulnerable, the pharaoh prepared methods to test those around him without ever exposing the uncertainty that made such tests necessary. By day, the pharaoh stood at the center of a carefully constructed world. Gold caught the sun, rituals unfolded with perfect rhythm. Every movement, every word, reinforced the idea that power flowed outward from him, complete and unquestioned. The court saw a living God, distant and immutable, sustained by symbols that left no room for doubt. Yet when night arrived, that image began to loosen, not publicly, but privately, where no witnesses were meant to linger. After sunset, the pharaoh withdrew from spectacle into guarded stillness. His chambers were not places of rest so much as containment. Doors were sealed one by one, not only to keep danger out, but to hold certainty in. Guards rotated with silent precision, their presence reassuring yet never sufficient. Each shift reminded the pharaoh that protection required constant renewal. Nothing was assumed to last through the night without effort. Inside these private spaces, rituals lost their public meaning. They were no longer performed to affirm divine order, but to soothe unease. Familiar words were repeated, gestures retraced, symbols arranged and rearranged. The repetition was not habit, it was reassurance. Each act whispered the same promise, that order still held, that nothing had slipped beyond control. Yet the very need to repeat these rituals revealed their fragility. The pharaoh spoke less at night. Words carried risk in darkness. Instead, he listened. He listened to footsteps outside his chambers, to the cadence of guards changing posts, to the distant sounds of a palace that never truly slept. Every sound became a question. Was it routine or deviation? Was it coincidence or intention? Silence, too, demanded interpretation. An expected noise that failed to arrive could be more unsettling than one that did. This was the paradox of absolute power. The higher authority rose, the fewer people could be trusted fully. Loyalty was never static. It shifted with ambition, fear, and time. The pharaoh understood this better than anyone. His survival depended not on belief in his divinity, but on continuous assessment. Trust could not be granted permanently. It had to be monitored, tested, renewed. At night, without ceremony to reinforce hierarchy, power felt exposed. There were no crowds to affirm obedience, no rituals to project certainty outward. The pharaoh faced the quiet truth that authority required constant attention to remain intact. A single misjudgment, a single overlooked shift in loyalty, could begin a chain reaction impossible to stop once daylight returned. This awareness shaped how the pharaoh moved through the night. He did not pace restlessly or show outward anxiety. Such behavior would betray weakness. Instead, he practiced vigilance disguised as calm. His stillness was deliberate, his pauses measured. Even alone, he maintained discipline, knowing that discipline itself was a form of defense. The illusion of omnipotence required careful maintenance precisely because it was convincing. Those who believed in it behaved differently, more predictably. Fear and reverence produced order. Doubt introduced chaos. The pharaoh could not allow doubt to surface, not even within himself. And yet, night had a way of inviting it. Darkness removed distractions. It stripped power down to awareness and responsibility. Guards were instructed to rotate frequently during these hours, not because danger increased, but because stagnation bred complacency. Fresh eyes mattered. Familiarity dulled perception. The pharaoh trusted process more than individuals. Systems, unlike people, did not dream or hesitate, but systems were built and maintained by people, and that truth could not be ignored for long. Within the sealed chambers, the pharaoh confronted the limits of his reach. He could command armies, rewrite laws, reshape cities. He could not see every corner of his own palace. He could not hear every whisper, interpret every silence. This gap between authority and knowledge was small, but it was enough to cause unease. Power was strongest when it appeared complete, weakest when it revealed its edges. The court outside sensed this tension, though it was never spoken. The pharaoh's silence at night carried weight. Those summoned during these hours entered cautiously, aware that every interaction mattered more than it did by day. A word misplaced could echo longer in darkness. A gesture misread could linger in memory. The absence of witnesses made each exchange feel heavier, more personal. Absolute power, the audience begins to realize, was never absolute in practice. It was negotiated constantly through observation and restraint. The pharaoh did not rule by confidence alone. He ruled by vigilance, by anticipating shifts before they became visible. This vigilance demanded energy, attention, and an acceptance that certainty was an illusion requiring daily reinforcement. The night magnified this truth. Without the sun to sanctify signals of dominance, authority depended on quiet systems working without failure, guards listening rather than watching, servants moving without being seen, priests interpreting signs without overreaching. All of it converged around a single figure who carried the weight of maintaining balance. The pharaoh never slept easily, not because of fear of assassination, but because of awareness. Sleep meant surrendering control, even briefly. It meant trusting that the systems he had built would function without his supervision. This trust was necessary, but it was never comfortable. He rested, knowing that his power endured only as long as nothing unexpected emerged while he was unaware. This is where the image of the untouchable God-King fractures. Beneath the golden ceremony was a human consciousness calculating risk in the dark. The illusion of certainty required effort precisely because it was so effective. Those who benefited from it did not need to understand its maintenance. The pharaoh did. As the night deepened, vigilance replaced rest. Thoughts turned inward, measuring loyalty without revealing doubt. The pharaoh understood that asking direct questions invited answers he could not control. Better to let behavior reveal itself naturally, without prompting. Better to create conditions where loyalty emerged unforced. From this need grew a different approach to power, one that avoided confrontation and thrived on subtle testing. If authority could not be confirmed openly, it could be measured indirectly. And so, in the quiet hours when even God seemed vulnerable, the Pharaoh prepared methods to test those around him without ever exposing the uncertainty that made such tests necessary. Fear did not arrive in the Pharaoh's court as chaos or panic. It arrived quietly, shaped carefully, until it felt less like an emotion and more like the natural state of things. This was not fear imposed through constant punishment or visible cruelty. It was fear cultivated through uncertainty, and it proved far more effective than force ever could. Rules existed, but they were rarely clarified. Expectations were implied rather than stated. What was acceptable one night might be questionable the next, not because standards had changed, but because interpretation had. Consequences followed no predictable pattern. One mistake might pass unnoticed. Another, nearly identical, might end a career. Favor appeared suddenly and vanished just as quietly, leaving those affected searching for meaning where none was offered. The absence of explanation was intentional. This unpredictability ensured obedience without resistance. People stopped asking what was required and focused instead on what felt safe. They adjusted constantly, refining behavior in response to outcomes rather than instruction. Each individual became their own enforcer, anticipating judgment before it arrived. The court no longer needed frequent punishment. The possibility of punishment, undefined and ever-present, was enough. Fear became internalized. It shaped thought before action, hesitation before speech, restraint before initiative. People learned to govern themselves, not out of loyalty, but caution. This form of control was efficient because it required no visible hand. No clear enemy could be named. There was no single figure to resist, no decree to challenge. The danger was everywhere, and nowhere at once, embedded in routine. The Pharaoh understood this deeply. He did not need to assert dominance openly. Doing so would have clarified the boundaries he preferred to keep blurred. Instead, he allowed uncertainty to do the work. By withholding clarity, he prevented opposition from forming around shared grievances. Confusion isolated individuals from one another, ensuring they faced fear alone. Governance shifted from command to atmosphere. Control was no longer enforced through orders or threats. It was absorbed into daily behavior, into the way people stood, spoke, and waited. The court became disciplined without appearing rigid. Compliance felt voluntary because resistance had no clear target. Everyone adjusted inwardly, assuming fault rather than questioning the system. This did not cause collapse. On the surface, the court stabilized. Open conflict diminished. Disputes resolved themselves before becoming visible. People avoided extremes. Moderation became survival. From the outside, the palace appeared orderly, efficient, even harmonious. Yet beneath this calm lay constant tension, held in place by shared uncertainty. Trust suffered most. When consequences were unpredictable, honesty became dangerous. Speaking openly risked misinterpretation. Silence felt safer. People shared less, revealed less, relied less on one another. Relationships became cautious, provisional. Loyalty thinned, replaced by careful coexistence. Cooperation continued, but it was brittle, easily disrupted. Fear also distorted perception. People began to see patterns where none existed, assigning meaning to every outcome. A delayed response became a warning. An unexpected invitation became a test. Even kindness carried risk. Was it genuine or strategic? Was it noticed or recorded? This constant interpretation exhausted the court, yet no one dared to stop. Because fear lacked a visible source, it could not be confronted. It could only be managed individually. This fragmented potential resistance, each person believed their anxiety was personal, the result of their own mistakes. Collective awareness never formed. The court remained stable precisely because its members felt isolated within it. Over time, fear reshaped values. Courage was replaced by caution. Initiative gave way to restraint. Original thoughts softened into repetition. The palace did not demand this transformation. It emerged naturally from the conditions imposed. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not faded quietly from view. This system rewarded predictability, but punished certainty. Acting with too much confidence suggested ignorance of danger. Questioning openly suggested entitlement. The ideal courtier appeared calm, adaptable, and unremarkable. Standing out, once a path to favor, became a liability. Blending in offered protection. The pharaoh benefited from this atmosphere because it reduced the need for direct intervention. His authority remained intact without constant assertion. He could observe rather than react, knowing that fear would prevent most challenges from ever forming. Governance became indirect, resilient, and difficult to trace. Yet this stability came at a cost. Genuine loyalty withered. Trust could not flourish where rules were unclear and consequences inconsistent. People protected themselves first. Always. The court functioned, but it did so without warmth, without confidence, without shared belief. The audience begins to sense how familiar this feels. Not because the setting is ancient, but because the mechanisms are human. Fear works best when it is subtle, when it shapes behavior quietly, rather than demanding obedience loudly. The pharaoh's court did not invent this truth. It refined it. As fear settled deeper into routine, identity itself began to change. People no longer presented themselves as they were, but as they believed was safest. Masks formed, adjusted nightly. Faces became careful. Words became measured. Behind this discipline, private selves fractured, retreating further into silence. This was the unintended consequence of fear as governance. It maintained order, but hollowed it out. The court endured, but something essential receded. Power remained, but authenticity vanished. And in that absence, something new began to take shape. When people live long enough behind caution, they learn to live behind masks, preparing the way for a court where nothing is ever quite as it seems. By day, identity in the pharaoh's court was clear and rigid. Titles announced themselves before a word was spoken. Clothing marked rank. Posture revealed status. Ceremony reinforced boundaries so consistently that few ever questioned them. Everyone knew who they were meant to be while the sun was overhead, and deviation carried immediate risk. Daylight rewarded performance and punished ambiguity. Night dissolved that certainty. When the lamps were lit and the palace narrowed into shadowed corridors, the structures that defined identity loosened their grip. Authority did not disappear, but it became quieter, less visible. Without constant display, roles softened. Courtiers spoke differently. Guards listened more than they commanded. Scribes lingered longer in conversations they would never have approached during the day. The night offered space to shift, to adjust, to become something slightly altered. These changes were subtle at first. A tone lowered, a gesture relaxed, a truth hinted at rather than concealed completely. Conversations after dark carried a different weight, not because they were louder or bolder, but because they were less constrained. Words that would have been dangerous beneath the sun could now be spoken softly, wrapped in ambiguity. Trust, even temporary, became possible. For some, the night was a release. It allowed them to reveal thoughts they kept buried during daylight hours. Doubts about policy, quiet frustrations, private observations about others. These were not declarations of rebellion. They were moments of honesty, brief and fragile, offered only when witnesses were few. The night made these exchanges feel safer, even if they were not. For others, darkness offered opportunity of a different kind. Instead of revealing their true selves, they constructed alternate ones. A courtier might become more obedient, less visible, smoothing their presence until it barely registered. Another might grow sharper, more calculating, using the loosened structure to test influence. A guard might shift from rigid authority to quiet confidence. Each version was intentional, shaped by what felt safest in that moment. These double lives were not performances meant to deceive everyone. They were survival strategies. The court had taught its inhabitants that authenticity carried risk. To be known fully was to be vulnerable. To remain adaptable was to endure. Identity became something adjustable, worn differently depending on light and shadow. Few spoke of this openly, but everyone felt it. Over time, maintaining these shifting selves required careful attention. A person had to remember which version of themselves belonged to which hour. A joke shared at night could not surface by day. A confidence expressed in shadow had to retreat before sunrise. Mistakes were dangerous. Blurring these boundaries invited suspicion. The court noticed inconsistencies quickly. This constant adjustment created tension that never fully resolved. Living behind multiple faces demanded discipline. Emotions were managed, reactions delayed, impulses suppressed. Some learned to enjoy this control, finding safety in precision. Others felt themselves thinning, unsure which version of their behavior reflected truth. When survival depends on performance, sincerity becomes difficult to locate. The palace did not discourage this fragmentation. In many ways, it depended on it. People who could adapt were less likely to challenge authority directly. Those who concealed parts of themselves were easier to manage. Identity, once fluid, became another instrument of governance, shaped by fear and necessity rather than choice. Nighttime gatherings reflected this shift. Alliances formed and dissolved quietly, based not on declared loyalty, but on shared understanding. Two individuals might align after dark, exchanging information or support, then behave as strangers by morning. These arrangements were rarely permanent. Permanence invited exposure. Flexibility ensured survival. Even priests, bound by ritual and doctrine, were not immune. By day, they embodied certainty, interpreting divine order with measured authority. At night, some questioned privately what they proclaimed publicly. Others leaned more deeply into symbolism, using ambiguity as protection. The sacred, like identity, proved adaptable when scrutiny lessened. The audience begins to feel the strain of this existence. Living in contradiction wears quietly on the mind. The need to calculate which self is safest becomes constant. Trust erodes, even inwardly. People stop asking who they truly are and focus instead on who they must appear to be. Over time, the distinction blurs. Some reached a point where the mask felt more natural than the face beneath it. Performance replaced instinct. Habit replaced belief. The court rewarded consistency, not authenticity, and those who survived longest learned to deliver exactly what was expected in each context. Whether that expectation aligned with their inner self mattered less with each passing night. This fragmentation did not create chaos. It created caution. The palace became a place where nothing was taken at face value, including oneself. Every interaction carried layers. Every expression might conceal intent. This atmosphere reinforced silence and restraint, tightening the loop of control already in place. Yet fragmentation also created cracks. When identity is flexible, so is truth. When people live behind masks, secrets find room to grow. Some secrets were shared carefully, guarded closely, meant to survive. Others were spoken only to release pressure, meant to vanish before dawn. The night made both possible. As identities fractured, certainty weakened further. The court continued to function, but with an undercurrent of unreality. People moved through their roles with precision, yet something essential felt displaced. Behind the careful performances, private selves receded, watching from a distance. This was the cost of survival in the dark. To endure, one learned to become many things, none of them fully. The night rewarded adaptability, punished consistency, and blurred the line between protection and loss. And in this environment, secrets multiplied naturally, waiting for the moment they would either protect or destroy the one who carried them into the next stage of the night. Some truths in the Pharaoh's court were never meant to endure. They were spoken quietly, carefully, with the shared understanding that their purpose was temporary. These were not secrets guarded for future leverage or dramatic revelation. They were burdens, released into the darkness so they could dissolve before daylight returned. The night offered protection not because it concealed, but because it forgot. Certain conversations occurred only when witnesses were few and memory felt uncertain. Two figures might stand near an unlit corridor, exchanging words neither intended to repeat. No scribe recorded them. No servant lingered nearby. Even the speakers treated the moment lightly, as if the act of speaking was less important than the relief it brought. By morning, these truths were expected to vanish, leaving no trace behind. Forgetting became an act of loyalty. Remembering too much was dangerous, not because the knowledge itself was forbidden, but because permanence created risk. A remembered truth could resurface at the wrong time, in the wrong context, through the wrong mouth. The court preferred uncertainty to accuracy. Precision invited challenge. Ambiguity preserved balance. Secrecy, in this sense, was not about hiding information from others. It was about containing it within a moment. Some knowledge existed only to release fear or doubt, to test trust between two people, or to acknowledge a concern without committing to action. Once that purpose was served, the knowledge was meant to fade. Holding on to it beyond its usefulness suggested attachment, and attachment invited suspicion. The night encouraged this impermanence. Darkness softened edges, blurred details, and made memory feel less urgent. Words spoken without witnesses seemed less real by morning, as if they belonged to a different version of the palace. This separation protected everyone involved. If a truth disappeared, no one could be held accountable for it. If it returned, it would do so altered, stripped of certainty. The court learned to treat memory as selective rather than absolute. People remembered what was safe and forgot what was not. This was not weakness, it was discipline. The ability to let go became as important as the ability to observe. Those who clung to information, who repeated details too accurately or recalled conversations too clearly, were quietly marked as liabilities. This intentional forgetting shaped behavior. Conversations were framed loosely, filled with suggestion rather than detail. Names were avoided, timelines blurred, responsibility dissolved into implication. The goal was not to deceive, but to prevent meaning from solidifying. Solid meaning demanded response. Fluid meaning allowed time. Some secrets were spoken only once, never to be acknowledged again. Others surfaced briefly over several nights, changing shape each time until they lost coherence entirely. This erosion was deliberate. The court trusted fragments more than facts. Fragments could not be assembled easily. Facts demanded reckoning. The audience begins to feel the unease of this system. Truth, normally treated as something to uncover and preserve, becomes disposable. Knowledge itself carries risk. To know too clearly is to stand out. To remember too precisely is to invite attention. Survival depends on knowing when to let meaning slip away. This practice stabilized the court by preventing certainty from forming. Without certainty, opposition struggled to coalesce. Without shared facts, alliances remained tentative. People acted cautiously, guided by atmosphere rather than conviction. The palace avoided open conflict not because tensions did not exist, but because they never hardened into something definable. Even personal memories were shaped by this logic. Individuals learned to doubt their own recollections, to soften conclusions, to treat past conversations as impressions rather than records. This self-editing protected them. If memory was fragile, it could not betray them. If truth was uncertain, it could not be used against them. Yet this came at a cost. When truth dissolves too easily, trust becomes difficult. People question not only others, but themselves. Did that conversation really happen as remembered? Was that promise implied or imagined? The line between certainty and assumption blurred, leaving individuals anchored only by instinct. The court accepted this trade without protest. Stability mattered more than clarity. Order mattered more than understanding. The palace endured because it allowed knowledge to evaporate before it could become dangerous. In this environment, secrets were not treasures. They were tools, used briefly, then discarded. As dawn approached, these spoken truths faded into the background of routine. Morning rituals resumed, faces returned to their practiced expressions. The night's conversations left no visible mark, yet their absence shaped what followed, guiding choices without ever announcing why. This was the quiet power of secrets meant to die by morning. They relieved pressure without creating obligation. They acknowledged fear without demanding resolution. They allowed the court to function without confronting itself too directly. Truth survived only as long as it was useful, then dissolved into silence. As secrets vanished, something else took their place. Absence. What was not remembered became as influential as what was. Gaps formed in the record, not by accident, but design. Over time, these gaps shaped how events were understood, how stories were told, how authority justified itself. The palace learned to govern not only behavior, but memory. And as memory became selective and fragile, history itself began to change shape. What endured was not what happened, but what could safely be recalled. From this controlled forgetting emerged a larger silence, one that extended beyond the night and into the future, shaping how the court would be remembered long after its voices had faded. History, as it survived from the Pharaoh's court, was never a complete account. It was a surface, polished carefully, until only certain reflections remained. What endured on stone walls, papyrus scrolls, and ceremonial inscriptions was not the full story of power, but the version safest to remember. This was not an accident of time. It was design. The court understood that memory could be governed just as behavior could. By choosing what entered the official record, it shaped how authority would be perceived long after those in power were gone. Certainty was favored. Processions, victories, divine endorsements, orderly succession, these moments translated cleanly into symbols and text. They reinforced the image of a world guided by intention and stability. Uncertainty, by contrast, was dangerous. It raised questions that could not be easily answered. Nighttime events rarely appeared in official records. Silent loyalty trials, whispered accusations, quiet removals, and unexplained absences left no mark in stone. They were not omitted because they were insignificant, but because they were too revealing. Writing them down would have acknowledged ambiguity at the heart of power. The court preferred continuity to accuracy. Scribes were not passive recorders, they were interpreters, trained to understand which moments could be preserved and which needed to dissolve. They knew that writing was not neutral. To inscribe an event was to grant it permanence and legitimacy. To exclude it was to weaken its influence over time. Silence, in this context, became a deliberate act. What made this control effective was subtlety. No decree announced what could or could not be recorded. Instead, scribes learned through observation and consequence. Certain topics were avoided instinctively. Certain details softened or omitted. Patterns emerged. Events that aligned with divine order were documented thoroughly. Events that suggested doubt or internal tension faded into absence. This absence did not mean nothing happened. It meant what happened could not easily challenge the narrative. Future generations would see a continuous line of authority, unmarred by hesitation or fear. The court understood that stability depended as much on memory as on force. If people believed order had always existed, they were more likely to accept it in the present. Nighttime governance was particularly vulnerable to erasure because it left few witnesses. Decisions made quietly, punishments enacted subtly, tests conducted without announcement. All of these could disappear without contradiction. There was no dramatic moment to record, no public confrontation, only outcomes detached from cause. History absorbed the result while forgetting the process. This selective memory shaped how authority justified itself. Divine favor appeared uninterrupted, loyalty seemed consistent, challenges vanished without explanation. The record suggested inevitability rather than effort. Power appeared natural rather than maintained. This illusion protected the system by discouraging inquiry. If order had always been present, questioning it felt unnecessary, even dangerous. The audience begins to recognize how familiar this pattern feels. History often privileges clarity over complexity, resolution over tension. What survives is what fits. What challenges coherence is left behind. The Pharaoh's court did not invent this tendency. It refined it, turning a mission into policy without ever naming it. Silence became a form of documentation. What was not written communicated as much as what was. Absence signaled boundaries. It taught readers, even centuries later, where curiosity should stop. The gaps were not empty. They were guarded. This control extended beyond official inscriptions into collective memory. Stories repeated within the court softened over time, shedding uncomfortable details. Repetition favored what felt safe to recall. Over generations, these repetitions hardened into truth. The original uncertainty disappeared, replaced by confidence that felt ancient and unquestionable. Power, in this way, extended beyond governance into time itself. By shaping memory, the court shaped interpretation. Future rulers inherited not only authority, but a narrative that justified it. Resistance became harder when the past appeared seamless. Without evidence of fracture, fracture felt impossible. Yet what was erased did not cease to exist entirely. It lingered in subtle ways, in behaviors that seemed overly cautious, in rituals repeated with unusual intensity, in spaces within the palace that felt avoided without explanation. The absence left traces, even if they were never named. For modern observers, this realization unsettles certainty. What we know of the Pharaoh's court is not wrong, but it is incomplete by design. The grandeur survives. The anxiety does not. The monuments speak. The silences do not. And yet, those silences shape decisions just as profoundly as anything carved in stone. Understanding this reframes history itself. The past is not merely what was preserved, but what was permitted to endure. Power chose its own memory, pruning away elements that complicated its image. What remains feels solid precisely because it has been stripped of doubt. This is why omission matters, not as absence, but as influence. What was not written still ruled. It governed perception, guided interpretation, and protected authority long after those who enforced it were gone. The court may have vanished, but its method endured. As the narrative reaches outward toward the present, a new tension emerges. If history was shaped by erasure, then understanding the past requires attention to what cannot be seen. Evidence tells one story, absence suggests another. Between them lies the truth the court works so carefully to dissolve. To follow that truth, one must look not only at what survives, but at what never could. The next step is not excavation, but imagination disciplined by absence. Because the most powerful forces in the Pharaoh's court left no artifacts behind, and yet they shaped everything that followed. Archaeology gives us stone, bone, and ink. It uncovers walls that still stand, objects left where hands last released them, and inscriptions carved to last longer than memory. These remnants feel solid, dependable, reassuring. They suggest that the past can be reconstructed if we search carefully enough. Yet when it comes to the Pharaoh's court, the most influential forces left nothing that could be buried, unearthed, or displayed behind glass. No artifact records a whispered warning shared in a corridor and never repeated. No fragment preserves the moment a servant chose not to deliver a message, or a guard decided not to intervene. Fear does not fossilize. Silence leaves no imprint in stone. Intention evaporates the instant it is acted upon. The mechanisms that shaped knightly power were designed to disappear the moment they succeeded. This absence is not a failure of archaeology. It is evidence of effectiveness. The court engineered its control so that it would leave no physical trace. A system built on suggestion, restraint, and omission does not require monuments. In fact, monuments would have undermined it. Proof invites questioning. Absence ends inquiry before it begins. When archaeologists reconstruct palace life, they can map rooms and pathways, but not hesitation. They can identify ritual objects, but not the doubt that surrounded their use. They can read official texts, but not the conversations deliberately kept from record. The most decisive moments unfolded between what survives and what never could. The audience is invited to sit with this discomfort. History feels safer when it is complete, when every cause has an effect that can be traced. The Pharaoh's court denies that comfort. Its power rested precisely on what could not be pinned down. A deliberate pause altered outcomes more than any decree. A withheld word carried more force than an army. None of this left residue. Absence, then, becomes testimony. The lack of evidence is not emptiness, but shape. It outlines the boundaries of what was allowed to exist openly. Where the record is smooth, something has been polished away. Where certainty feels too perfect, something has been removed to make it so. Modern viewers often search for hidden chambers or secret scrolls, hoping for dramatic discoveries that explain everything. But the truth of the court is quieter. It lies in what cannot be recovered because it was never meant to endure. Power protected itself by ensuring its most effective tools were temporary, invisible, and unverifiable. This reframing asks the audience to imagine history differently, not as a complete account waiting to be assembled, but as a surface curated by authority. What we see is not false. It is selective. It tells us what power wanted remembered, not how it was maintained. The gaps are meaningful. They signal where fear operated without announcement, where loyalty was tested without ceremony, where control moved without command. These gaps are consistent, patterned, deliberate. They speak to a system that understood memory as a liability. By acknowledging what archaeology cannot show, we gain a clearer view of what truly mattered. The court's endurance did not depend on visible force alone. It depended on internalized restraint, self-surveillance, and uncertainty that left no mark. These forces shaped behavior long after physical traces faded. The honesty of this limitation strengthens the narrative rather than weakening it. It admits uncertainty instead of pretending mastery. It allows the audience to recognize that some truths survive only as impressions, patterns, and echoes. This recognition does not diminish the past, it deepens it. Understanding the Pharaoh's court requires attention to what is missing as much as what remains. Silence, fear, and intention shape decisions more reliably than law or architecture. They guided actions precisely because they could not be challenged directly. From this absence, a broader picture emerges. These hidden systems did not merely affect individuals. They shaped stability itself. The empire endured not because it was transparent, but because it was opaque. Power survived by staying out of reach, even of history. And so the story widens. What began in corridors and chambers extends outward into generations. The same invisible mechanisms that left no trace in the palace also shaped how the empire functioned as a whole. From what cannot be seen, we begin to understand what endured. The palace corridors were only the beginning. What happened within them after sunset did not remain contained behind stone walls. Nighttime governance shaped the empire far beyond the reach of torchlight, influencing decisions that would ripple outward across decades, sometimes centuries. The mechanisms refined in silence did not simply manage individuals. They stabilized a civilization. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its continuity, a civilization that endured while others fractured and vanished. This endurance is usually credited to geography, tradition, or military strength. Yet beneath those visible supports lay a quieter foundation. The empire learned to manage instability without spectacle. It learned to absorb tension before it could surface. Night became the space where this work was done. Decisions that appeared sudden by day were often prepared carefully after dark. Successions were shaped long before crowns were placed. Policies announced with confidence had already been tested against fear, resistance, and uncertainty in private. By the time the public encountered these choices, they felt inevitable. The night had already removed alternatives. This process reduced open conflict. Rivals were weakened quietly rather than challenged directly. Loyalty was tested without forcing declarations that might harden opposition. Those who posed danger rarely became martyrs, because they rarely appeared to be victims at all. They simply faded from influence. The empire avoided rupture by preventing pressure from building visibly. Silence functioned as insulation. Fear encouraged restraint. Selective trust ensured that power flowed through narrow, controllable channels. Together, these forces created an illusion of uninterrupted order. To outsiders, Egypt appeared stable, divinely guided, unchallenged. Internally, the system was constantly adjusting, correcting, and redistributing influence in ways that left no scars. Night served as the empire's pressure valve. When tensions arose, they were released quietly. A questionable official was reassigned. A policy idea was abandoned without debate. A family line lost favor gradually rather than violently. None of this appeared dramatic. That was precisely why it worked. Drama attracts resistance. Quiet adjustment dissolves it. This approach came at a cost. Transparency suffered. Decisions were rarely explained fully, even to those affected by them. Trust became conditional and fragile. Yet, from the perspective of survival, these costs were acceptable. The empire valued continuity over clarity, order over understanding. The audience begins to see how permanence was maintained not by strength alone, but by constant recalibration. What looked like divine certainty was, in practice, human vigilance refined over generations. Each pharaoh inherited not just power, but a system designed to manage fear without provoking rebellion. Over time, these methods shaped behavior across society. Officials learned caution. Ambition softened into patience. Initiative became measured. This slowed change, but it also prevented sudden collapse. Egypt did not adapt quickly, but it adapted steadily. The night taught it how. This stability created confidence. Confidence reinforced belief. Belief strengthened authority. The cycle sustained itself, even as its origins remained hidden. People accepted the order of things because it appeared ancient and unbroken. Few questioned how much effort it required to maintain that appearance. Nighttime governance also shaped succession more than public ritual suggested. Potential heirs were observed long before selection. Their reactions to uncertainty mattered more than their speeches. Their restraint mattered more than their vision. By the time a successor emerged publicly, the night had already decided they were survivable. This reduced the risk of civil war. Transitions appeared smooth because dissent had been neutralized quietly. The empire did not eliminate conflict. It dispersed it. Pressure was never allowed to gather in one place long enough to explode. The same principles applied beyond the palace. Provincial administrators learned to mirror this restraint. Local power adjusted quietly. Loyalty was managed through implication rather than force. The empire's center set a tone that spread outward, shaping governance across distance and time. From the outside, Egypt seemed unchanging. From within, it was in constant motion. That motion was simply concealed. The night absorbed instability and returned calm. This is the deeper reason monuments endure. They were built on a foundation of controlled uncertainty. Stone projected permanence. Silence maintained it. Together, they created the impression of inevitability. The audience now understands that empires are not preserved by certainty, but by managing doubt. Egypt survived because it learned to live with fear without letting fear rule openly. It contained anxiety rather than denying it. This reframes divine kingship. The pharaoh was not powerful because he was unquestioned. He was powerful because questions were managed before they could be asked aloud. Night was the space where that management occurred. What looked like stillness was movement too subtle to see. What looked like order was adjustment disguised as tradition. The empire endured not because it never changed, but because it changed invisibly. From this perspective, Egypt's longevity feels less miraculous and more methodical. The night shaped behavior, filtered ambition, and softened conflict. It ensured continuity by refusing spectacle. As the story widens, a realization begins to form. These patterns are not confined to one place or time. The same quiet mechanisms appear wherever power seeks endurance without disruption. The palace was only one expression of a larger truth. Darkness, uncertainty, and silence have preserved more empires than force ever could. And with that understanding, the narrative prepares to move beyond Egypt itself, toward the patterns that repeat wherever power learns to govern without being seen. The mechanisms that governed the pharaoh's court did not vanish with the collapse of temples or the fading of gods. They dissolved into patterns, carried forward not by stone or text, but by human behavior itself. When viewed from a distance, ancient Egypt begins to feel less like a remote civilization and more like an early mirror, reflecting tendencies that surface wherever power seeks endurance without exposure. The night ruled not because it was ancient, but because it was effective. Ambiguity discouraged challenge. Selective memory softened conflict. Unspoken rules ensured obedience without confrontation. These were not cultural accidents. They were responses to human nature, refined through repetition. Wherever certainty threatens stability, uncertainty is invited in its place. The audience may begin to recognize structures that feel familiar without being named. Loyalty tests that are never announced, yet somehow always felt. Consequences that arrive without explanation, leaving no clear moment to resist. Truth spoken only in private, with the understanding that they will not survive public scrutiny. These patterns do not belong to one era. They emerge whenever authority learns that visibility carries risk. The court of ancient Egypt becomes less distant here. Its rituals, fears, and silences echo beyond time, not because they were unique, but because they were intuitive. The pharaoh's power adapted to how people think, fear, and protect themselves. It did not require constant force. It required conditions where restraint felt safer than resistance. Darkness, in this sense, is not simply the absence of light. It is a condition where authority reshapes itself quietly. It is where rules become suggestions, where memory becomes flexible, where fear is internalized rather than imposed. These conditions do not announce themselves. They settle gradually, becoming normal before they are noticed. What survived in Egypt survived because it aligned with instinct. People learned to govern themselves under uncertainty. They adjusted behavior preemptively. They avoided extremes. They waited. These responses reduced open conflict and preserved order without spectacle. The system endured not because it was imposed, but because it was absorbed. The absence of explicit comparison allows these connections to remain personal. Each listener recognizes something different. A workplace where expectations shift without explanation. A community where speaking openly feels unsafe. A system where compliance is rewarded quietly and deviation punished indirectly. None of these need to be stated. The recognition forms on its own. This is the quiet power of pattern. It does not demand belief. It invites recognition. The pharaoh's court becomes a lens rather than a lesson, showing how authority adapts when it seeks longevity over clarity. The audience is not told what to think. They are given space to notice. The night never stopped ruling because human behavior did not change. Fear still shapes decision before action. Silence still feels safer than certainty. Memory still bends under pressure. These are not moral failures. They are adaptive responses. Power that understands this thrives. Seen this way, ancient Egypt is not exceptional. It is instructive. Its endurance was not accidental. It refined methods that minimize disruption while maximizing control. Those methods continue to surface. reshaped by context but driven by the same instincts. The palace, once thought distant, now feels intimate. Its corridors echo with choices still made elsewhere, in different forms. The same calculations occur. The same silences carry weight. The same ambiguity protects authority. This realization does not accuse. It explains. It reframes history as a study of behavior rather than belief. Gods change. Symbols fade. Patterns remain. As the narrative begins to fold back inward, toward the palace where it began, the court no longer feels mysterious. It feels understood. Not fully revealed, but familiar. The night, once a setting, becomes a principle. And so, the story returns to the corridors and chambers where silence ruled, now seen clearly for what they were. Not anomalies of the past, but early expressions of a logic that still moves quietly wherever power prefers not to be seen. From here, the palace itself waits again, unchanged in stone but altered in meaning, ready for one final walk through the darkness where everything learned now reshapes what can be felt, even when nothing more is said. The palace stands exactly as it always has, yet it no longer feels the same. Stone walls rise in familiar lines, courtyards open into the same measured spaces, and torches burn with the same steady patience. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has. With each step into the night, the audience carries an awareness that cannot be set down. The palace is no longer a structure, it is a system. Awake and listening, footsteps echo softly across polished floors. Once, those echoes might have seemed empty, accidental, without consequence. Now they feel deliberate, timed, absorbed by walls that have learned to remember without recording. A pause in sound suggests more than absence. It suggests choice. Somewhere nearby, someone has decided not to move, not to speak, not to be seen. Servants pass through the corridors with eyes lowered, their movements precise and unhurried. They do not acknowledge those they pass, not out of indifference, but discipline. Their silence carries weight now. Each lowered gaze feels intentional. Each careful step a negotiation with unseen judgment. They are no longer background figures. They are threads holding the palace together, moving through spaces that others are permitted to forget. Guards stand at intervals, their stillness unnerving. They are not rigid in the way daylight demands. They are alert in a quieter sense, balance between motion and restraint. A guard who shifts too often would draw attention. One who never shifts might do the same. The balance is exact, and it feels practiced, refined over years of listening more than watching. The palace trusts them not to act, but to notice. A curtain stirs briefly, then falls still. A priest disappears behind it without sound. There is no ritual spectacle here, no incense thick enough to announce purpose. The sacred moves quietly now, wrapped in familiarity. What once seemed mystical now feels cautious. The gods, if they are present, are listening rather than speaking. The corridors feel narrower than memory suggests. Not physically, but emotionally. Knowledge compresses space. Every doorway feels significant, not because of what lies behind it, but because of what might have passed through unseen. The palace no longer feels empty at night. It feels crowded with intention. The audience notices how the light falls unevenly. Shadows gather in places that feel chosen rather than accidental. Lamps burn lower than expected, not failing, but conserving. Darkness is no longer absence. It is coverage. It allows things to exist without being defined. Once, the silence might have invited imagination. Now, it invites recognition. This quiet is not peaceful. It is attentive. It absorbs movement, hesitation, breath. The palace listens to itself and to everyone within it. Nothing is wasted here, not even stillness. A door closes somewhere in the distance, softly, without urgency. The sound lingers longer than expected, stretching into the dark. That delay feels intentional. The palace does not hurry conclusions. It lets them settle. Every space now feels layered. What appears ordinary on the surface carries a second meaning beneath it. A bench near a wall is no longer just a place to rest. It is a point where someone once waited too long, or not long enough. A corner where light barely reaches feels like a place where words were chosen carefully, then left unsaid. This final walk offers no new revelations. It does not uncover hidden chambers or forgotten texts. Instead, it reveals familiarity transformed. The palace has always functioned this way. What has changed is perception. The audience understands now that nothing here is accidental. Not the spacing of rooms, not the timing of movement, not the silence between sounds. The absence of explanation feels deliberate. Words would weaken what has been learned. Meaning here is carried through atmosphere, through what is felt rather than stated. The palace resists summary. It prefers implication. As the walk continues, time seems to slow. Not because the night stretches endlessly, but because attention has sharpened. Small details matter more now. The faint scrape of fabric, the controlled rhythm of breathing, the way footsteps adjust when passing certain thresholds. These signals were always present. Only now do they register. The audience is no longer observing history. They are inhabiting it, if only briefly. The palace does not feel ancient in this moment. It feels immediate. Its systems feel familiar, almost uncomfortably so. Eventually, the path leads back toward the outer halls. The deepest corridors recede behind closed doors. The palace does not resist departure. It allows it. What it does not allow is forgetting. The awareness gained here lingers, settling quietly, much like the systems that shaped it. The final steps feel lighter, not because tension has lifted, but because understanding has replaced uncertainty. The palace remains vigilant, but it no longer feels threatening. It feels honest in its silence. As the audience leaves the inner spaces, the structure returns to stillness. Lamps continue to burn, guards remain in place, servants move on their routes. Nothing changes. And yet, nothing can be unseen. The palace does not announce its presence. It does not reveal its secrets openly. It never has. It waits, confident that those who have learned its language will hear it even in silence. This final walk is not an ending. It is recognition. The night has not revealed something hidden. It has revealed what was always operating quietly, shaping behavior without command. The palace recedes into darkness, but it does not sleep. It never did. Its systems remain alert, balanced, patient. Long after the torches dim and the corridors empty, the awareness remains. Once you understand the night, it never looks empty again. The palace fades first in the mind, then in imagination. Stone gives way to shadow, corridors dissolve into distance, and the night releases its hold. Yet something remains. It does not announce itself, and it does not demand belief. It lingers as a sensation, subtle and difficult to locate, like the awareness of being observed without knowing by whom. What operated within the Pharaoh's court did not vanish when the torches went out for the last time. The rituals ended, the gods changed names, the walls crumbled, but the behaviors endured, reshaped by new settings and quieter language. Silence still carries weight. Observation still replaces confrontation. Loyalty is still tested without warning. Power continues to prefer discretion over declaration. It listens more than it speaks, watches more than it acts. It waits for instinct to reveal what intention would conceal. The methods refined in darkness did not depend on stone or ceremony. They depended on people responding predictably to uncertainty, fear, and the need to belong. The audience is invited not to resolve this realization, but to sit with it. There is no final lesson to extract, no conclusion to seal. The discomfort is intentional. The Pharaoh's court never offered clarity to those within it. It offered atmosphere, implication, and consequence. The same is true here. History, like the night, leaves much unseen. What survives is not always what mattered most. What mattered often dissolved by design. Silence protected authority. Ambiguity preserved order. Observation replaced force. These mechanisms required no monuments, and so they left none. The palace itself becomes less important now than the pattern it revealed. The setting changes, but the logic remains intact. Wherever rules are implied rather than stated, wherever consequences arrive without explanation, wherever silence feels safer than speech, the night is present again. This is not accusation. It is recognition. Systems that endure learn to disappear. They embed themselves in routine, in habit, in expectation. They become difficult to name precisely because they feel normal. The Pharaoh's court perfected this long ago. The narration slows here, not to conclude, but to allow space. Space for the listener to notice the weight of what has not been said. Space for the feeling that something ancient has not left, only shifted position. The most enduring forms of power do not demand attention. They wait for it. Some courts never disappear. They change names, symbols, locations. They trade stone for glass, ritual for procedure, gods for ideals. But beneath those changes, the same quiet behaviors persist. Testing without asking, judging without explaining, watching without being seen. The palace no longer needs to be imagined. It exists wherever silence shapes behavior, wherever uncertainty governs choice. Its corridors are internal now, built from hesitation and restraint rather than stone. The story does not end because the pattern does not. It pauses. It recedes into quiet, where meaning gathers slowly. Nothing more needs to be said. What matters has already settled. The night remains.